Hello and welcome to the Come to Science webinar. Today, I have my pleasure to present Dr. Amie Steel, who will be talking about the osteopathic practice-based research networks, some examples from Australia and New Zealand. Amie, I had the pleasure to know Amie since a while now, and apart from her absolutely astonishing research abilities, indeed she's a senior research fellow at the Faculty of Health, University of Technology in Sydney. She's got also a leadership position in 4 practice-based research networks, in particular in Australia and New Zealand. And apart from being extremely successful in accessing to grants, over $1 million in research funding, she's one of the most talented people that actually are trying to bridge the gap between clinician and researcher. And in this moment is particularly important in order to create the right connection between these 2 words, in particular in osteopathic world. So Amie will be talking about the research, but in particular making this bridge possible, and how, from also a clinician point of view, we can use research in order to improve clinical practice so far. So, as always happen, please write your questions in the chat, and then we'll be discussing with Amie at the end of the webinar. There are other just few words regarding the upcoming webinars on the Come to Science, and there are one is from George Estevez next 24th of June, and he will be presenting persistent physical symptoms and the predictive mind. So we're moving towards the connection between research and how research can be used into the clinical practice, but from a neuroscience perspective. Again, stay tuned on the Quantum Global, that is our annual, the CAM Collaboration Foundation annual meeting. There will be in October, beginning of October. Everything seems to be confirmed, although the pandemic, and therefore stay tuned. And in particular, we look forward to receiving submissions in terms of calls of papers and abstract. You can find all the information on the website. There are some other interesting projects in addition to the Come to Science. There are research projects like the Research and Assistance to Support Education for Infants. That is a large pediatric neonatology network based, where actually we are providing research in terms of neonatology, but also clinical assistance into the hospitals. And again, the gap between the 2, we are trying to also to build these gaps, as well as other humanitarian and clinical-based research projects within the CAM collaboration. Again, follow us on here. You can also have the website and Facebook for further updates. Okay, so again, I would like to thank you, Amie, for you, since you've been connected from the Gold Coast. It's Sunday evening, so I would very much thank you for your kindness, your availability, and your professionalism in doing and presenting this workshop. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesco. And thank you for your very warm and generous introduction. It's an interesting perspective and I very much appreciate the opportunity to come and share my thoughts on some opportunities I think the osteopathy clinician and research community internationally have in front of them. So today I will be talking about practice-based research networks we've established for osteopathy in Australia and New Zealand. But I'm also going to share some of my thoughts on the direction we're heading within the field of osteopathy, the work we're already doing and can continue to do to ensure the research that's being generated means something in real-world practice for the clinicians who are out there providing care to the community. I want to acknowledge that I know that not all attendees to this webinar will be researchers or clinicians. There's a mix across the two groups. I hope you find the ideas I share today useful for clinical practice, for engagement with research, and for working alongside researchers. So to take you on my journey of ideas today, I'm going to highlight some key and somewhat competing paradigms in the current landscape of health research generally. I'm going to then explore how those paradigms can be employed by researchers within osteopathy to ensure that the work being done is relevant to real-world practice, and then propose the potential contribution that research infrastructure such as practice-based research networks can make to helping to bridge the divide between research and practice. And to start with, just to map out some of these key ideas within the contemporary health research and practice landscape, the concepts of evidence-based medicine, person-centered care, and real-world relevance have been growing and evolving in recent years. The most dominant of these three within health research is evidence-based medicine or practice, and I'm sure most people attending have, if not everyone, will be familiar with the principles of evidence-based medicine. So I'm not going to cover those again, but I want to focus on some important facets of evidence-based medicine, which will inform my discussion today. So firstly, evidence-based medicine grew out of the medical research community and was developed with the aim of improving the quality of healthcare by basing clinical decisions on evidence produced by clinical research, rather than the authority of expert clinicians. And it was, I think that's a noble and worthy aim. But to achieve this, the proponents of evidence-based medicine prioritize certain research designs, namely randomized clinical trials or meta-analyses of randomized clinical trials to inform clinical decision-making. Since the evidence-based medicine paradigm was first documented in the early 1990s, clinicians from a wide range of health professions, particularly in primary care, they questioned the applicability of those designs in complex interventions. And I think this is important for osteopaths to really understand, is that the challenges that a lot of clinicians and researchers within osteopathy raise and queries they raise about the validity of randomized controlled trials have been raised by other health professions who are out there in the community providing care in non-drug-based research. So they also queried the relevance of such a strong focus on RCT evidence at the expense of clinician expertise and patient preference. And that's what led to this modifying statement from the same group from Oxford, which was then developed, which acknowledged the value of these other factors in the application of clinical evidence. So just as much, clinicians from osteopathy were among those querying the applicability of the RCT to investigate the efficacy of their treatments and practices, and research, osteopathy researchers were alongside with the clinicians. At the same time that all of this was happening, the evidence-based medicine idea began to be wielded as a weapon against many therapies existing outside of mainstream medical practice. There was a really very famous quote that was published in The Lancet in the late 1990s. It said, "There is no alternative medicine. There is only scientifically proven evidence-based medicine supported by solid data, or unproven medicine for which scientific data is lacking." The underlying premise of this statement, published in The Lancet, was that clinicians within conventional medicine follow the evidence closely and will adopt and apply any treatment which is shown to be safe and effective. Yet Despite the modifications from the Oxford group responsible for describing evidence-based medicine in the first place, the realities of evidence-based medicine still saw research and clinical practice occurring in isolation, particularly because the RCT design focused on efficacy of treatments by excluding potential confounders, which essentially means that the research, whether it be clinical or mechanistic or observational, could be basic sciences or epidemiology, it was undertaken by researchers primarily in controlled settings as best as possible. And the domains of clinician expertise and patient values were within the evidence-based medicine idea were to be implied within the clinical encounter after the research was conducted. So through this process, through the clinical encounter, the clinician was left to tease out how relevant the RCT was and figure out how best to move forward with their patient's preferences and values in mind. Whichever the decision was that arose from the clinical encounter, the patient still needed to adhere to the recommendation or prescription within the constraints and realities of their life. So you can imagine all of those prescriptions that a trial has been conducted. It's been found that a certain, in a very restricted population, a particular treatment has been effective. A patient comes in who doesn't really quite meet that picture, even within normal clinical trial examples. So if you're talking about a drug trial using a particular drug to treat diabetes, but they've excluded people who have other health complaints or complications that could be confusing the findings. And then a patient comes into a doctor's surgery who actually has that complicating picture. The doctor's left to do their best to make the decision. And then the patient still has to decide whether or not they want to take the drug or they want to follow that treatment. And so there's separation between the research that was being done and the actual realities of providing care in the community to humans who are making their own decisions for their own health was still very separate. And the siloing of these elements of evidence-based medicine proved in many ways to really limit the ability of traditional RCTs to answer questions about real-world problems involving real-world people within real-world settings. And so their ability to make a real-world difference was limited as well. Now, alongside the evidence-based medicine paradigm, occurring in an almost parallel universe has been the person-centered care movement. This movement was derived from the person-centered care therapy model of Carl Rogers, has been championed by policymakers and, to a lesser degree, clinicians, not so much the researchers. It can be described as a systematic, whole-person approach to healthcare, accounting for all aspects of the individual's needs, values, environment, and available resources. And it's been incorporated into national and international guidelines across the health and medical community, ranging from the World Health Organization all the way down into national and even state guidelines in many countries. A substantial body of scholarship has built up surrounding person-centered care, largely in response to the priorities set by these policymakers. These are the people who are providing the funding for research and identifying what they consider to be most important, and researchers will follow where the money goes. And so that has attracted attention to this aspect of healthcare. So as we move beyond the dual paradigms of person-centered care and evidence-based medicine, the thread that we could say links the two is a growing need and expectation that the evidence of EBM means something to the patient and the clinician in the real world. And the knowledge needed to meet these needs is much more diverse than the research designs preferred by EBM proponents. So I've got here a list of knowledge requirements which are suggested to speak to the needs of both policymakers and clinicians, which are considered the groups of primary knowledge users in most areas of healthcare. I think, if we look at these particular knowledge types, they can offer us a great framework to reflect within osteopathy research to make sure that the research being done is truly relevant to the people we want it to be available to. For example, we need knowledge which helps identify the problems that need solving. Within osteopathy, we have to think, what are the problems? who gets to determine what they are? As researchers, whose problems are we solving? Another area is knowledge about existing effective research that's not well studied. Are we generating new knowledge, building on existing knowledge? How are we defining what knowledge exists? And are we only using research evidence, and where does the traditional knowledge and paradigms and philosophies fit? We also need to think about knowledge about how treatments work and how a treatment compares to alternatives. So this can be basic science type research, but what about principles-based or philosophies-based? Exploring the philosophical perspectives of different treatment effectiveness. And also considering what we mean by alternatives, because in conventional medicine research, an alternative is usually two different drug options. But usually when you move outside of mainstream medicine, what we are most commonly doing is comparing a treatment from within, say, osteopathy with a conventional treatment option and positioning those two as an alternative. But does that really help the osteopath understand which treatment approach is going to be most useful within their patients? And when will we start doing research that compares different osteopathy treatment options and understanding their effectiveness as comparing one to the other? We also need knowledge which defines our stakeholders. And do we actually really know who the stakeholders of osteopathy are? And really that underpins many of these other questions. And lastly, knowledge about why osteopathy is important and matters in the contemporary healthcare landscape. What's the importance, implications, and value of osteopathy? And that helps to link into us understanding its wider acceptability. So this flow chart on the right of my slide here is an example of the application of these knowledge types from a paper published almost 20 years ago. It's an epidemiology primary care journal. And it really emphasizes that the evidence-based medicine prioritizing of randomized clinical trials answers this first question of efficacy, but it doesn't ensure that the research is relevant for real-world decisions. Research, it has to also demonstrate effectiveness and then cost effectiveness. And then you have to show that even if something is effective in a real-world setting and cost effective, that there are people out there who can provide that service, who are appropriately qualified and located in a nice spread in the service area. And then also, if that funding or that support is put in by the government or by policymakers to support that particular service, where do they take the money from and who misses out from that process? And what's the implication of them reallocating resources? So there's all sorts of other questions that need to be answered beyond does it work? And as clinicians, we get caught in does it work? Or if we can often also get caught in how does it work? But the people who really make the decisions about access and scalability and funding, they want to know all these other questions. And in fact, the question of does it work is such a small part of the decision that they make. Sorry, I'm just skipping my slides. Here we go. Now, it sounds like I'm highly critical of evidence-based medicine movement. I know that the osteopathy research and practice community isn't immune to that allure of producing research evidence that can be synthesized via meta-analysis, translated into clinical practice guidelines or policy briefs, and then the idea being that we can watch the magic of that research evidence changing the face of policy and practice. But it's unfortunate that research alone doesn't actually inform practice. And as a process of knowledge translation is required to enable research evidence when it's produced to become meaningful to clinicians in their actual settings where they practice. Even clinical practice guidelines don't necessarily result in practice change, and this has been shown time and again, particularly if they're not designed with the realities of the target clinician community in mind. So there's several reasons why day-to-day practice might deviate from the evidence. And it's not because the clinicians don't care about the evidence. It's not because they're not interested in providing good quality, safe, effective, value for money care to their patients. Part of the problem has been historically that the burden of practice can mean that there's a mismatch between the demand for them to access the research and the availability of the resources, the time, the money, the staffing that's required to actually engage with research evidence in a way that's meaningful. There can also be a bit of a tension between professional ethics and bureaucracy. I mean, simply telling a health professional to follow a protocol or a guideline doesn't actually work if the actions conflict with their own sense of professional ethics. I'm certain that any clinician in this audience, it wouldn't matter what the evidence was telling them, if they were told to do something that they felt morally or ethically was not the right thing to do, then they would be applying their own clinical ethical judgment in that process. And there's also this highly fragile translation pathway, particularly when evidence is perceived to be generated very remotely from the setting or the practice that the clinician is in. If the practice that they're trying to have applied, if the research is supporting, is really complex, and there's lots of factors that are required to be working for that to be able to be used, or if the recommendation is somewhat politically divisive. And I'm sure there'd be a number of those. And not being an osteopath myself, I'm very sensitive to the fact that I'm not in a position to be stating what some of those politics are, but I'm sure anyone who's attending the webinar can think of some areas or topics that would be highly contentious within the profession. So where this leaves us is we really have to acknowledge the fact that the translation of evidence into a clinical decision is not a straight path. And as much as I as a researcher would like it to be. And I recently attended a fantastic knowledge mobilisation conference in the UK, where I heard the most accurate analogy for knowledge translation I've ever heard to date. There were two professors, John Gabay and Andre Lemay from the University of Southampton, and they described knowledge translation as a pinball machine. And the ball is the evidence, and there are so many local, cultural, social, and practice needs of the clinician. They're the levers and the springs and the traps of the machine. So really, if you think about the journey of evidence into practice through this lens, and understand that the evidence is not even a shiny metal ball that gets hit around the pinball machine, it's a ball of putty. And as it moves through the local practice context, it morphs and changes in response to the many local factors pushing up against it. And by the time it's actually used, it becomes irrevocably changed. And that's if it doesn't fall down a hole and is lost forever. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about, and I really want to speak to the researchers in the osteopathy community, is that we need to see that this application of evidence by the clinicians is not a flaw in the clinician's practice, but a weakness in the way that we generate evidence ourselves. The clinicians need to be able to make these street level decisions about which rules to apply and in which circumstances, if they're going to be providing that patient-centered care. Their approach must be individualized. It's a central tenet of osteopathy practice. And they have to judge the patient's values as well as the statistics. And so this approach is taking that approach, the clinician's approach, of modifying the evidence to suit their local context and their patient that's sitting in front of them at the time, is as aligned to professional relationship-based care and is the application of evidence-based medicine in person-centered practice. So the challenge that we have as researchers is to take proper account of the diverse knowledge that clinicians draw on when we design our studies. In the first place, to make sure that the evidence we produce is valuable and applicable to them. So one possible solution is progressing what is becoming known as bottom-up research. So I've already described the traditional mode of research or knowledge production, and it's quite top-down. In this type of situation of knowledge production, research is the stuff of dedicated experts in tweed jackets in universities and other evidence generating organizations. It's linear and it's top down and it's didactic knowledge translation. Evidence is gathered and synthesized by a central authority of some kind, turned into recommendations or in some situations mandates for practice, and the service providers are expected to assimilate and account for it in their day-to-day work. In a best case scenario, if we really embrace this approach, you get a uniformity of practice and a speedy introduction of evidence-based innovations. But even in such an ideal world, it also presents a risk that clinicians will implement a set of treatment principles rather than engage in an ongoing quest to be evidence-based practitioners. They're going to stop thinking and start just doing what the clinical practice guidelines tell them to do. And they're seeing this more and more in hospitals. They may achieve a stifled, obedient compliance with this mandated evidence, but it's at the cost of using alternative sources of evidence, such as practitioner knowledge or professional experience, and goodness forbid, intuition more creatively. So in contrast to the top-down approach, bottom-up research emphasizes locally driven evidence generation. In this kind of picture of the bottom-up research, there are no hard boundaries between knowledge production and utilization. Innovation is considered to be the product of close, continued interaction among clinicians and researchers. So in bottom-up research, we have an opportunity to find locally sensitive approaches to solve local problems or gaps in effectiveness in practice. So the main risk with this approach is that we unintentionally reinforce top-down institutional focuses, where you have researchers who consider it a priority and don't actually engage with frontline practitioners in generating the data and creating the evidence for improvement and putting it into practice. Essentially, what the bottom-up research approach can mean is that the ball of evidence putty that I talked about in the previous slide is already shaped to the local context. So it's less likely to change to suit the clinician's needs on the front line of healthcare because they help to make it in the first place. And so as evidence-based medicine meets patient-centered and real-world principles of contemporary practice and policy, a body of work is developing, which I referred to in the last slide. And it's around an idea which closely links to implementation science, and it's called knowledge mobilization. And so implementation science is a process of applying a research method to taking research and implementing it into practice. But knowledge mobilization is sort of the bottom-up researcher approach of implementation science. It acknowledges the value and importance of patient and clinician perspectives and insights when you're developing and driving a research and policy agenda and centering it around real-world relevance. Knowledge mobilization acknowledges that not all knowledge is derived from research. It views knowledge offered by the three different domains of evidence-based medicine as equal, and that there is a lot to gain by sharing knowledge between all of the parties, the patient, the clinician, and the researcher. And that's not to say that non-research knowledge cannot be captured and tested in a robust, rigorous, systematic way. In fact, it means the opposite. It means our research methods build in robust, rigorous, and systematic processes that should support sharing and integrating knowledge from all sources. So there's a participatory action research and initiatives like Involve in the UK have been emphasising the importance of public and patient involvement in health research. And these sorts of models or concepts are just as applicable to clinician involvement, particularly when researching treatments and practices that are structurally separated from conventional institutions. So your osteopathy practices are out in community, and if you're not conducting that care within a university or a hospital or a mainstream, highly structured clinical environment in that way, then we need to make sure that there are processes in place that connect your experiences and observations and know-how in with the researcher process to make sure that the work that's being conducted in research actually works within your experience. So in light of the ideas that I've kind of proposed so far, I want to explore how we can approach expanding the osteopathy research agenda to ensure the knowledge being produced is relevant to practice, informed by clinician experience, and based in real clinical environments. For clinicians to consider the research being produced to be relevant to them and their practice, they would want to consider a number of factors, including the treatment, making sure that the treatment intervention aligns with the clinician's philosophy of care, that the population reflects the clinician's patient base, and the treatment intervention reflects common practice. Particularly in a profession like osteopathy, where you're not currently looking for a lot of new options for treatment, you're trying to better understand the value and effectiveness of the treatments you're already using. One of the tools researchers can use to ensure our research is practice relevant and is to design research that is practice informed. So practice informed research is based on the idea that the evidence used to inform service delivery should come from a wider range of sources, mostly from those that use and deliver the service in the first place. For the osteopathy research community, that means working with osteopaths and osteopathy patients throughout the entirety of the research project. It's an approach which is commonly called co-design or co-creation. And the success of co-creation rests on those using it, realizing that all stakeholders in the system are interrelated. One group can't solve a problem without the input of the others. And emphasizes research as a process that it's constrained by rules and conventions, but it's still a creative enterprise with human experience at its core. And particularly when we're operating in a person-centered health system. So this presents an important question for the osteopathy researchers internationally to reflect on, which is, while osteopathy practices may be person-centered, is our research. And co-creation calls on all parties to participate as equal partners, requiring researchers to move from being the experts to the colleagues with the patients and the practitioners. And equally, the same shift is needed for clinicians collaborating with patients in research. So there's a growing recognition of the importance and democratizing potential of early and ongoing stakeholder engagement in identifying important policy and practice questions, and as well as having that continuous input in the knowledge building process. Expertise is diverse and it still remains a resource. And we can explore and exploit that in a lot of systematic ways if we apply this model. And so taking practice-informed research, co-creation, and knowledge mobilization, we take that into the context. There's a growing prominence within the conventional health research community, and its applicability to osteopathy is actually quite profound. The established linear research model, which is the first one that I have up here on my slide, begins with mechanistic or basic science research, the lab work, progresses, so this is for your traditional drug trials, transitions to explanatory research, explanatory RCTs, and then that's further examined through pragmatic comparative effectiveness studies, and then ideally it translates into practice. However, much of the knowledge production within osteopathy arises from documented experiences of clinician experts, with traditional knowledge as a prime example. And this experiential knowledge can be pragmatically tested in practice as it occurs, and then interrogated in more controlled explanatory research settings, and then examined to understand the mechanism of effect. So this dualism of these two different directions of drug discovery rather compared to practice-informed research is a useful construct, but it's not a universal truth, and it may not always be linear. But my point is that while conventional health research is developing models to better bring experiential knowledge into their research methodology, osteopathy, which arguably has more to gain in employing these methods, are not applying these models to our full potential. And this is where the practice-based research networks, or PBRNs, come in. The PBRN model has achieved popularity in the US following targeted funding from the US government in recent years. At ARCM, which is the research center that I'm based at, we've adapted the prevailing model in the US to suit a community-based private provider landscape. Most of the PBRNs in the US are based on entrenched health services that are firmly engaged within the wider health system through patient file management systems and those sorts of things. So I'm going to focus on the role PBRNs can have in facilitating better clinician-researcher partnerships for real-world research projects. But before I do that, I just want to differentiate between the prevailing model in the US and our ARCM novel approach. So in the ARCM approach, the US approach, the PBRNs emphasize big data. So they're collecting data from massive amounts of patient files that are collected through linked patient management systems, usually through hospitals or mainstream large health clinics. The problem with this for a profession like osteopathy is it's actually quite costly to set up that infrastructure if it's not already in place. And then the data that's often collected is retrospective, which means you're largely pulling data out of systems that are already been collecting data. And because of that, you're confined to the data you decided to collect at the beginning. So the approach that we take with our PBRNs emphasizes the flexibility of research to answer diverse research questions through diverse research methods. We've recently undertaken a review of PBRNs, including those that involve manual therapies. And this review found 2 osteopathy-focused PBRNs based on the published data that have under 200 osteopaths involved in each. Now, I've been told that the DO TouchNet has increased its numbers recently, but that hasn't, this was based on what was published in literature at the time that we did the review in 2019. At ARCM, we have 6 PBRNs in various stages of activity, 3 in Australia, 2 based outside of Australia, and 1 with an international footprint. They each have their own features, and I won't go into all of them, but I will just to give you a bit of familiarity. We've got ACORN, which is the first PBRN we formed and represented the first PBRN of its type in Australia. We then formed PRACI, which has 14 complementary medicine professions. It's the most diverse multi-profession PBRN for complementary medicine in the world. It's got over 1,000 members. ORC-NZ is a naturopathic academic clinic. So it's colleges linked together. It's international across 4 different countries and 2 world regions. And it's based on the US's Agency of Health and Research Quality PBRN registry. No other PBRN has this degree of global coverage. AMRET, which is an Ayurvedic medicine, one being set up in the UK. And then there's also a new physiotherapy PBRN that's in gestation. It'll be called Capri, I think. Our 2 osteopathy PBRNs are ORION. ORION, the Osteopathy Research Innovation Network, had the largest coverage of any health profession in the world for a PBRN, with 43% of the Australian osteopathic profession enlisted. That was until it was recently surpassed by ORC-NZ, the Osteopathy Research Connection New Zealand, which has 48% of the osteopaths in New Zealand as members. And there's a bit of friendly rivalry between Australia and New Zealand. So the New Zealanders were very happy that they had ended up with such a high number. Combined, both of those PBRNs represent 45% of the Australasian osteopathic profession. Despite the unique achievements of each of these, they all share some universal characteristics. They all support data collection in a naturalistic setting related to naturalistic practice. These are real-world clinicians, real-world patients, real-world treatments. And the structure of our PBRNs work very well for clinicians who are outside of the entrenched, structured infrastructure of the mainstream health system. So just to introduce you properly now to ORION and ORC-NZ, they're funded by the osteopathy associations in both countries, Osteopathy Australia and Osteopaths New Zealand. And they have shared project aims. Oops. They've shared project aims. They have the same aims, just different country names. So I've just replicated them here. To advance broad, rigorous scientific investigation, to inform the osteopathy profession and patient care, to conduct research in osteopathy that is relevant to the practice and practitioners of each country, to help facilitate critical research capacity and help produce a sustainable research culture in osteopathy for both countries, accommodate and encourage osteopathy research network building and collaborations, and to facilitate closer engagement and communication between osteopaths and researchers. The PBRNs are all have fully active now. So we went through a preparation, design and promotion period where we spent a lot of time informing the profession, the clinicians in both countries about what the PBRNs were, what it meant, because it's really important that they understand what it would mean for them to be involved in terms of any burden or time for them, but also what it would mean for their profession to have their contribution. Through that practitioner recruitment, we sent out a survey that collected baseline information, and I'll talk a little bit about that information, and set up the database of the network. And then we established our sub-study and expression of interest process to facilitate researchers starting to utilise the infrastructure. And now we're just going through the process now of maintaining that database and facilitating the sub-studies. The exciting thing about this research being funded by the two professional associations is it doesn't cost anything for researchers to access the infrastructure. So we have 992 osteopaths in Australia and 253 in New Zealand on these involved in these PBRNs. So based on my estimations, that's about nearly 8% of the global osteopathic profession. And I just want to acknowledge the foresight of the two professional associations and the clinicians in both of those countries in getting involved because without the support or the involvement of the profession, these PBRNs cannot happen. So just to give you a very brief overview of some key aspects, this is just a summary, and this is published in a paper, and these data, but of the baseline characteristics that we collect in this survey. And it's primarily focused on getting the information we need to help researchers target and figure out where they should prioritize some of the research focus that they're doing. So we collect this baseline information in this survey. And you can see some of these aspects. It allows the potential for interesting questions to be developed. We've got information about their co-location with other health professionals. So there's obviously general practitioners and specialist doctors and physiotherapists, and the varying mix between those. And where that is really useful is if a researcher wants to look at the practice characteristics of osteopaths who are sharing location with a lot of conventional health providers, general practitioners, podiatrists, physiotherapists, versus those who are sharing a clinical space with acupuncturists, naturopaths, for example. There might be some variations in how they practice, the sorts of patients that they're treating, where they're trained, where they're located, is it rural or remote? There's a capacity to actually understand a little bit more about the texture of the profession just from that sort of information. And for researchers who really want to target a particular subsection of the clinician population, they have the information that they need to understand what that looks like. And then we, as the curators of the database, have the ability to pass on an invitation to participate in further research to a targeted section of the professional community. So this approach, what it allows for is that focus on the aspects of practice that are most common to osteopaths can be more effectively employed. And it also allows researchers to wanting to focus on a very specific aspect of practice to target those relevant clinicians and also frame their study accordingly. So you can see from here, you know, neck pain, thoracic spine, low back pain, hip pain. These are the real, particularly those top three, the neck and back pain, thoracic pain. They're the most commonly treated conditions. So if the professional associations really wanted to target the sorts of treatments or the sorts of conditions that were most prevalent in the practitioner community, they've got some really good information about where to go for that. But also there are some people, not very many, but some people, very rarely do people say rarely, but there's also other conditions that are less common. So the TMJ patient, clinicians who are often treating temporomandibular joint disorders, what is it about these particular patients, practitioners that's attracting those? Or if you wanted to do a study that looked at a clinical treatment for TMJ disorders, you can just focus in on those particular clinicians and invite those particular clinicians to be involved in your study, because you know that they actually have a higher number of patients compared to the other 38% who rarely see TMJ. So that's where the sort of spread can be really useful. Equally, if you're talking about different populations, having that information is really useful. So we've collected similar data across both PBRNs so that where appropriate, the researchers can develop studies that can be conducted in Australia and New Zealand as well. And so the capacity in some instances to have multiple sites, and so you only need 5 sites. And then if you have 5 sites in 2 different countries, you'll have 10 sites, and you're collecting data from 4 or 5 patients per site. You end up with 50 patients involved in a study, in a multi-center international study. And the burden on the individual clinicians is not particularly high because they're only having to collect data from 5 patients. The rigor of the data that you've collected is more robust because it's not, is Joe Bloggs, the osteopath, effective? It's spread out across locations and clinical sites and practitioners as well. So the information and a breakdown of exactly how you can use these sorts of the PBRNs being published in scientific reports. There's a link here, which you can just pop into a search. It's open access, so anyone can download and read it. You don't need a university subscription or anything like that. So what happens next? There's a couple of layers of what we can do now that we have this information. The first is secondary analysis of the data. We can use these baseline surveys that we've collected the data for in setting up our database and analyze that data and write up those papers without going back to the clinicians at all. Now, that's certainly not using the PBRNs to their full potential, but it is one aspect of what we can do. And we can use that to describe the characteristics of osteopathy practice, which we've done. And here's some examples of other types of papers that have been generated from secondary analysis. So, you know, the characteristics of osteopaths who discuss lifestyle factors with their patients, because, you know, osteopaths don't just use their manipulative techniques. They do other things. They talk to their patients about stress, about exercise, about stretching, about sleep, about diet. There's all sorts of things that are part of the holistic osteopathy consultation that this data has, you know, allows you to actually write up, and that's where this has started to happen. The prescription rights information, because of the transition for osteopathic research community in Australia, has resulted in some of the academics, the osteopathy academics in Australia, writing up a paper on the osteopaths who showed interest in prescribing medicines and what that looks like and what that might mean. And then focusing in on, you know, the osteopaths who manage sports-related injuries and the sort of treatments that they use. Those who have referral patterns to and from general practitioners and what that evidence is about the degree of integration of osteopathy into mainstream healthcare. So after the secondary analysis, we also have the sub-studies, and this is really where the rubber hits the road with osteopathy PBRNs. And so this is where the researchers can start to collaborate more directly with the clinicians. So there's an expression of interest form with researchers who've conceived of a project idea. They have to fill that out, show who's going to be on the team, what's a research question, what's the model and design. The steering committee, which consists of researchers and osteopaths, review that to make sure that it aligns with the aims and the objectives of the PBRN, and that their methodology is robust, and that the osteopaths aren't being asked to engage in research that's not going to be effective in answering the question that it's attempting to answer. Once that's done, and then there's been ethics approval given, then our team will identify the appropriate osteopaths to receive an invitation to participate in that. And so we will take the contact information, depending on the type of study that it is. If it's just a survey, then we'll just send out a link to the right people, the osteopaths that are relevant. If it's a plan to actually collect data in the clinic, then there'll be some clinician information and a contact for the researcher for them to contact and continue on the discussions from there. And that then allows the recruitment of the PBRN members to occur. Oh, sorry, my thing's stuck. There we go. So the sort of studies that we can do are really diverse. Pragmatic clinical research, as I said before, where we can identify multiple sites in multiple countries and collect data of clinical treatments as it's actually being provided in real life naturalistic settings to the sort of patients who would usually be accessing this kind of care. And there's also observational research. It could be studies. It could just be cross-sectional data. There can be qualitative research. We could be capturing some of those people who are providing care to ethnic communities and interviewing them about their experiences and the process that they go through and how they explain and adapt their treatments, if they do, to that particular community. And then even case reports and single subject research. If you can have 3 or 4 cases, particularly if it's a really rare condition, you can still identify that condition or in that particular population and collect case reports. As I said, the details of some of this is outlined in that scientific reports paper I mentioned earlier. Just to give you some examples of some of the sub-studies already in progress. One is being led by a researcher at the Victoria University in Australia, looking at the osteopaths' use and attitudes towards patient-reported outcome measures. So, PROMs being very useful for evaluating your treatment effect, or argued to be so. And this study is actually looking at how much osteopaths are using it and what their experience of them are. Another is led by another researcher at Victoria University, but these are collaborative. They have researchers from multiple institutions involved, and it's looking at the knowledge, attitudes and beliefs of osteopaths towards pain and how they conceive of it and how it fits within their models and paradigms. There's also another one which is very much evolving at the moment. I want to just show you how this can, the journey of these sorts of things can happen. So a group of osteopathy researchers wanted to do some work involving older patients. To get the funding that they need to do the trial that they want to do, they need some preliminary data. And so the first thing that we did was we did a secondary analysis of the baseline survey data that we'd already collected in setting up the PBRN and on the prevalence and profile of Australian osteopaths treating older people. So that's been published. And that only took 6 weeks from the time that we identified what the data was that needed to be done to the time that we'd submitted the paper for publication, because of the fact that the data was already there and the pool of researchers that came in were very competent, and we were able to turn it around very quickly. So it's very quick to be able to identify that data and progress it into something. From that, there's going to be a sub-study that will go out through the PBRNs, which will survey explicitly about how the osteopaths who do frequently treat older patients, how they manage pain in their older patients, because the survey was really just saying the people who say they treat older patients frequently, they also said they use these treatments frequently, but we didn't know if they were using those treatments on older patients. So the survey will be another bit of work that will help to lead to that. And what we'll be able to do by capturing that information is then looking at designing a clinical trial that incorporates these treatments that are commonly used by osteopaths who commonly treat older patients, and making sure that any trial design or treatment intervention mimics or reflects the experience and the practice behaviours of the osteopaths who are already out in the community regularly treating this population. So to give you some more examples, I'm just going to return to some of our more established PBRNs because ORION and ORC-NZ are relatively new. And I want to show you how that clinician researcher partnership, which is really inherent to PBRNs, can really generate research for the real world of osteopathy. So our US naturopathic doctor, Dr. Joshua Goldenberg, led a team of researchers to explore the approach to the naturopathic management of irritable bowel syndrome through a Delphi study, which is it's like a survey to get consensus and agreement from experts. And this Delphi study involved US naturopathic doctors with a specialized interest in the condition. And it led to a new project, which was the catalyst for starting up this new PBRN, ORC-NAC. It was a prospective observational study capturing the outcomes of naturopathic treatment for IBS. And it was conducted across these 8 clinical sites in Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand. And it explicitly doesn't follow a protocol, but rather records the individualized treatments prescribed by naturopathic students and the outcomes of those treatments. It'll be the first international clinical study to be conducted for naturopathy, and there are plans for a second Delphi study to be conducted in Australia as part of Josh's continued program of research on the topic. There's a link between understanding practice and how practice works and feeding that into a PBRN has occurred. Another example is Bradley Leach, is a PhD student at Arkham, and he conducted an honours project. He used Pracky to survey naturopaths and clinical nutritionists and others about their clinical experience of intestinal permeability. And a large focus of his study was describing the types of health conditions that the clinicians had observed to be linked to intestinal permeability. He surveyed clinicians' experiences in treating IP, and he found that their findings shared some similarities with the aim of Joshua's Delphi study, but the direction he's taking his data is somewhat different. Brad's collected his data through Pracky, and as well as identifying the alignment between the clinician's observations and the existing evidence regarding intestinal permeability, he also noticed some gaps in the application of evidence in their practice. So he's undertaking a co-design project using this knowledge to action cycle, which is very common in implementation science, to co-create clinical practice guidelines for the effective diagnosis of intestinal permeability. He's going to partner with clinicians and patients and industry to do this, and he's going to produce a tool that will apply practice-informed evidence to support evidence-informed practice. And the only way that he's able to generate that putty of evidence is by working with the clinicians in the real world practice, which he's done since the beginning of this study. Rebecca Reed's another PhD student at Arkham, and she's undertaken a research project which explored the treatments of women's reproductive complaints in traditional naturopathic texts, as well as textbooks used in contemporary naturopathic curriculum in Australia and the United States. From the work that she's done, she's been able to identify treatments that have been historically associated with naturopathic management of endometriosis and dysmenorrhea, menorrhagia, and also those that are taught to modern day naturopaths. In some instances, she identified treatments which are still used today, but are not commonly prescribed for these conditions. She also identified treatments that have stood the test of time and are still being used. Through a relatively simple research method, she's begun to systematically document the prevailing expert opinion on naturopathic treatment of reproductive conditions. And now her content analysis integrates the expert opinions documented in traditional and contemporary naturopathic texts. And in the next phase of her project, she surveyed naturopaths in current clinical practice as a method of drawing on their experiential knowledge from treating women's reproductive complaints. So she's going to capture their insights into how the traditional and contemporary treatments that she identified in her content analysis are used in routine daily care and the value that's placed on them in the management of endometriosis in particular for her study. And once she's done this work, the varied knowledge types, the traditional knowledge, the contemporary texts, the clinician's experience will be able to be triangulated and synthesized to inform an intervention for a clinical trial. And this clinical trial could also be conducted through Pracky, which is where she's conducted her survey, so that the clinicians who help to inform the study in the first place will actually help be able to undertake the trial and collect the data and provide the information that we need to better understand how these treatments work. And just as a last example, and this more speaks to the infrastructure of PBRNs and the value of having them set up, I just want to show you Hope Foley's research on patient-centered care. These papers that I've got here represent the first outputs from a program of work undertaken by Hope. This preliminary research was conducted, this one here, as part of her honours degree, where she worked to map out the principles and philosophies attributed to a range of complementary and integrative medicine systems and their alignment with the domains of person-centered care. She did a systematic review and a survey of patients attending a multidisciplinary complementary medicine clinic. Now, her work is still continuing, but strongly supports the premise that complementary medicine clinicians do largely provide the person-centered care that policymakers are keen to see offered. Where that becomes particularly relevant is that her original research was conducted as part of her honours degree, but she's now enrolled in a PhD, and her PhD builds on her previous work. And it's surveying patients of 5 professions: massage therapy, acupuncture, osteopathy, chiropractic, and naturopathy, about their experiences of receiving care with a specific focus on the domains of person-centered care. Now, these 5 professions were chosen because her PhD explores person-centered care in patients with chronic disease, and these professions were among the most common services accessed by patients with chronic illness in Australia. But her original project planned to focus on massage therapists, acupuncturists, and naturopaths because we had Pracky set up. And but because of the existence of both Acorn and Orion, she was able to easily extend her project to include osteopaths and chiropractors. Her project was the first to be conducted across all 3 of these Australian-based PBRNs, and her results are currently in the final stages of journal review, so I can't give away all of the details. We hope to see them published within the next month, so please keep your eye out for the papers when they are published. I usually share my recent publications on Twitter, so you're welcome to follow me there. But the main point for this is that had Acorn and Orion not existed, she would not have collected data for chiropractic and osteopathy, because it would have been too much extra work for her to do that within the scope of her PhD. And so really that comes down to why does that matter? Why bother with a PBRN to undertake projects like this? And it's the clinician researcher partnership of PBRNs is probably the central aspect of it. The collection of local data increases the translation and uptake of results. Clinicians are contributing data from their own practice, and they know the findings relate to practices just like theirs. Bradley Leach's study, for example, will be that much more powerful because he's working with the clinicians who his original survey was based on to improve what they do. They are less likely to dismiss his work as irrelevant if they contributed to the findings. Secondly, it's also an efficient use of osteopathy research resources. You'll notice, with the exception of the ORC-NZ study with Joshua Goldenberg, each of the projects that I've presented are the work of research students, and that's not a coincidence. There are other studies being done using these PBRNs that I could have shown you that are led by very experienced researchers. But these students are not operating with large grants and substantive institutional support. They are leveraging the infrastructure of the PBRNs to produce research with very little funding that has real and meaningful impact, not only to their field, but to the clinicians they are working with to collect the data and produce the knowledge. Now, for any researchers listening, I'm not sure what your experience of research funding is like, but this is a very appealing attribute to most researchers. I know, and it works for the clinicians too. The infrastructure of the PBRNs means more evidence is being generated in these professions. Hope Foley's extended her project to include the osteopaths and the chiropractors of Australia. Osteopaths and chiropractors, simply because of the existence of these profession-specific PBRNs. And those osteopaths and chiropractors will benefit from the evidence if this is what the project finds, that they deliver person-centered care to patients with chronic disease, given the current policy guidelines in Australia are calling out for Australian health services to do just that. There are multiple other examples of studies that have run or are being run through our PBRNs that would not have transpired had the PBRN not existed. And I know this because the researchers have told me. The value of the simple existence of this infrastructure should not be underestimated. And PBRNs also create a community of practice. They create links between individuals across clinic and research and support that practice-informed, practice-relevant, practice-based research. They offer a network of like-minded individuals and a sense of, give them a sense of contributing to something larger than themselves. And the community that creates is invaluable among professions that are commonly characterized by solo community-based practices that are often structurally, if not geographically, isolated from other health professions and services. The ORION and ORC-NZ PBRNs, I believe, offer an opportunity for osteopathy in Australia, New Zealand, and internationally. They provide an opportunity for researchers to conduct exciting research projects that answer questions with data from real clinicians, and in doing so provide answers that are most likely to mean something in the real world of practice. They provide an opportunity for clinicians in Australia and New Zealand to contribute to the evidence base for their profession. And the PBRN model we use in Arkham could easily be rolled out elsewhere in the world. You just need researchers and clinicians to come together for the good of the profession. And on that note, I just want to thank you all very much for your attention and offer to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was very informative, full of insight, and definitely a way forward into looking at research and how we can use research to inform clinical practice and how clinical practice can inform research. So thank you very much for this. Okay, so again, I would like to remember everyone to write the question on the chat. So I'll be going through the different questions, Amie, and then rephrase them and then give it to you the floor to answer. So okay. Paul is asking, when trying to set up a PBRN in Switzerland, we ran a study to investigate and have practitioners and stakeholders express their needs for such a network. Clinicians did not see the interest of a network to help them develop their own practice. What was done in Australia and New Zealand to help them engage in profiling their profession?
A lot of talking, a lot of talking. So my colleague, Professor John Adams, and I did a lot of presentations. In New Zealand, there's a smaller practitioner community, and it's a smaller country than Australia, which is, much bigger. So in New Zealand, we basically drove around the North and South Island of New Zealand, which was beautiful. But doing information sessions, so they had all of these networks of and easily Switzerland you could do this as well. And we ran what you would call town hall meetings almost, and the local community centers for all of the osteopaths. They had like little study groups. They hosted us, and we went around from every single one and gave a presentation, explained exactly what it was, what it would mean for them, both the burden and the opportunity of it, answered questions. And we also took the approach that we didn't start recruiting for people to be involved in the PBRN until we had been saturating them with information about it for at least 6 to 9 months. We needed it to get to a point where they said, not a single osteopath in either of the countries could say, I have never heard of this thing before. What we needed them to say was, enough telling us about it, when do we get to sign up? And that was a lot of, for Australia, it wasn't as easy in terms of doing those town hall meetings because it's a much bigger country. So we focused on the osteopathy conference, and because it was funded by the association, we had some fantastic support from the association. They sent out newsletters and from the CEO of the association, from the president of the association. They identified the opinion leaders in the profession and had them send information out. We went to visit all of the researchers and all of the, because there's 3 universities that have osteopathy programs. We met with those, explained to them what was involved. And, we really had to just push that. So that, honestly, it's the first step in my 3-step program was the project design and the logo and all of those kinds of things as well. So they got something that some stickers they could put up in their clinic, so they had something in terms of what's in it for me, that they could differentiate themselves to show in an environment where clinicians are constantly, particularly if you're not in mainstream medicine, being asked to justify or protect yourself as an evidence-based practitioner, to have a sticker on their clinic to say, I'm part of this research network. I do take research seriously. It is important to me. All of those things, they all came together, the branding, the messaging. And just so much talking. As I said, we spent 2 weeks, 1 week in each island at different times of the year. And then we presented at one of the osteopathy conferences in New Zealand to announce that it was going to be done. And then we did all of this road work. And then 2 years later, we had the final presentation and on the day of that final presentation was the day we made the survey go live in New Zealand. So it was a massive promotional campaign, basically.
So, and if I understood correctly, so all the costs were covered by the associations, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, Paul, thank you for the very informative and the answer. Bernadette said, from many UK osteos work as a sole practitioners, as usually happens. Recently, many have shown great fear of change, such as use of PPE, etc. in practice. How can you empower them to participate in practice-based research with any confidence? So I think you kind of already answered these questions so far.
Yes, I will add something in specific to that question, though, which is one of the things that we focused on was that one of the parts of our model, which I didn't really talk about in my presentation, but is really important to that question, is that the clinicians aren't asked to change anything about their practice to be involved that they don't want to change. And so I know there have been talk about trying to have, osteopaths all using the same proms in their clinic and those kinds of things. And there is value in that. And but it aligns a bit with the big data PBRN model of the United States. One of the things that, because we use the sub-study design, is that if a particular study is being done that the timing's just not right for the osteopath in their clinic, the research question doesn't quite suit their patient or population or practice technique, or the burden of the data collection is going to be just too much for them to manage, or it doesn't align with the way they usually take their case note files for this particular project, then they can just choose not to participate. Every single sub-study has an opt-in option. And one of the things we really emphasized during our recruitment is that you can just sign the question. So you can sign on to the baseline study and for whatever reason over the course of time, don't even do a single sub-study after that, and it doesn't matter. But if you're not on that network to begin with, you will never get the option. These studies will go on and you will never have the opportunity to be involved in them. And so we really emphasize those two things. One is the individual decision-making, keeping in mind that clinicians are in community, they're self-employed, they've got a lot of things going on. They set up their clinics in a way that work for them, and that you can't enforce a structure on top of them, because in doing so, you force people out. It becomes an equity issue, and we didn't want that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And what about patients? How are they involved in PBRN?
It depends on the study. And so just to show you, with Hope's study, she had the clinicians give out a little card that said, we want to get you to fill out a survey for us if you don't mind. Here's the card, here's the link to the survey, please go away and do it. We've run a pragmatic study through Praki using massage therapy for low back pain. And that had the patients actually completing an online survey, online prospective data collection about their symptoms and what have you. And so we had an email going out to them to do that. Some of this stuff is just surveys, or it could be also, because of the diverse research questions and research designs, it's entirely up to the, depends entirely on the study as to how much patients need to be involved. But one of the things we emphasize is that the study design has to take into account that these are real world clinical environments, and they have to have that pragmatic end. You won't be doing randomized controlled experimental designs in a PBRN. That's not what the PBRN is for. That's what your university clinics are for, when you really want to control for all of your confounders. And so that aspect is really, the patients are involved as much as they need to be.
Excellent. So another link, a question linked to you to this point: how you can keep the practitioners and patients being involved in the long term?
We've got a few different things that we do. One is just keeping them updated in how things are progressing. We've had a few situations where some of our PBRN data has actually been used to inform policy change, and we make sure that that information gets fed back into the PBRN members. It's just letting you know that the decision that's just been made by the government in regards to your profession, the positive decision that's been made, part of the information that they drew on was information that came from your practice.
Okay.
And so just giving them that idea, because it's really hard when you're in grassroots clinical care to really see the big picture of how being a part of these things can answer your question. One of the other things that we did also say to people, which touches on something I mentioned earlier, but in our recruitment, was if you feel like your practice is really unique, then you want to make sure that you're in these PBRNs. Otherwise, the unique aspects of your practice won't be captured. And when the profession is described to people outside, then the types of things that you do won't be there, and then it'll get lost. And so we wanted to make sure we didn't just get the run-of-the-mill osteopaths who were treating low back pain. We wanted to make sure we were capturing the diversity of practice and practitioners in the PBRN.
Excellent. So another question. So you proposed a very interesting model. So model 1 and model 2, top down and bottom up. That was extremely interesting and very, let's say, possibly impacting the future, also in terms of planning research and the way in which people, also clinicians, might think about research and the two elements. So do you think there is there are contacts between the two models, and if so, which type of bridges you might find between the two modes?
I think that we create these models with very firm lines between them because it looks good on a graph or on a slide. But you're right; it's not always straightforward, and there can be a lot of crossover. But I think we're not at risk of losing top-down research. I don't think that's going to disappear.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. I'm putting all of my efforts into supporting bottom-up research because it needs to have attention. And even I mean, some of these examples that I've given, there's still researchers who've come up with some of these questions. So it's still top-down in some of these examples, but they're clinicians who are also researchers. But even so, even within bottom-up, unless a true bottom-up research is a clinician who comes up with a question and then engages and pairs partners with a researcher and really drives it from that perspective, or a researcher who just goes out to clinicians and says, hey, what do you want me to research? You know, that's true bottom-up research. So even these other examples, you still have some of those researcher intentions coming down. And I think we'll end up with, particularly when you've got clinicians who are spending, you know, osteopaths aren't in hospitals where you've got well, in some instances they are, but they're not like the nurse community or the medical community, where you have people who are in institutions who are explicitly there to facilitate research activity and work with the clinicians. And that's their whole job. And they get paid an hourly rate to do that. We don't have that in osteopathy. So you end up with a hybrid sort of model anyway. So I think that the model that will end up progressing through things like the PBRNs will always have a hybrid. You'll always have a bit of a top-down idea where the clinicians are still just there busy every day looking after the community and providing good care. And then a researcher will come and say, hey, there's this thing that's going on. I'd like to be able to work with you on it. And where it starts to be bottom-up is when the clinician says, well, you want to do it this way, but I'm letting you know that the way it actually works in clinic is a bit more like this. And that co-design will start to happen in that space. But it has to start, that conversation has to start early on for it to have any aspect of bottom-up research in it.
So this is also linked to the fact that the knowledge mobilization is part of this change so far. Transferring knowledge in a different way might also create the bridge. I mean, from a theoretical point of view, the bridge between the two modes so far.
I think it's vital. I think, and we in professions like osteopathy, where you have this really rich traditional knowledge and clinician expertise, that knowledge mobilization technique is what needs to happen. It'll be the thing that will drive the really valuable research questions being generated and answered.
In line with this question, Paul asked, how can we theoretically argue that practice-based research needs to go the other way around? And what evidence exists that this actually works and leads to solid knowledge that is worth transferring to education and practice?
So are you saying what?
So how
can we argue that practice-based research needs to actually come from practice and needs to be bottom up? That's an excellent question, and I think the argument probably is slightly answered in the negative, which is to say that we don't really have any evidence that the top-down approach is effective. Well, actually, no, we have a lot of evidence that it's not. We have a lot of evidence that evidence has been created from the top-down, researcher-led, experimental designed is not translating into practice. It's not working. Clinicians in multiple professions around the world are saying, this doesn't work for us. You're not giving us evidence we can use, or for whatever reason, I can't apply it. And that's where I come back to the fact that we actually need to start to think differently about it and come up with a solution that doesn't blame the clinician for not using our evidence. And I think that that part of it.
So it keeps going, and in grant application, we need to argue that top-down implementation does not work for complex interventions, and that bottom-up research is for funding.
Correct. And there's really great work that's being done. There's a woman called Annette Boaz who's written this fantastic book on evidence. I've got it on my bookshelf here. It's like What Works Now or something it's called. But this whole knowledge mobilization, it is actually really quite well established in the UK, and it hasn't permeated out to other countries as much as it could. But absolutely, that is exactly the thing that needs to happen. We need to make the point that if we want to answer questions that people are going to be able to use those answers in the real world, then we need to start from a real world context. And really that other directional design of basic science to experimental design to pragmatic research, that really only works when you're discovering a new treatment. Whereas what we're trying to understand is treatments that already exist, and how do they work best, and what situations don't they work, and all of those other things. That we actually need to start with what's already being done.
Excellent. So Kylie asks, would it be correct to consider PBRN as a database of osteopathic clinicians that welcome participation in research?
That can be the case. And I think that one of the things that we focused on a lot in our recruitment or our promotion, I guess, of the PBRNs when we were setting them up was that it to try and capture more than just the ones that are welcome participation in research. I think we got to the point where we're saying you need to be part of this for the sake of your profession, for the sake of your own clinical practice. You need to be part of this. And so I think at the simplest level, yes, it's about clinicians that are committed to the idea of generating evidence from grassroots practice. Yeah, I think that is absolutely the case. I think, though, we've probably captured people who are less committed to that explicitly and in some of the messaging that we've used, but in general, that's probably the case. So
I think one last question, Amie, so just to keep the Sunday night going for you. In the context of the diagram that you show of Detsy and Nagley, 1990 on Annals of Internal Medicine, right? So that there was absolutely an insightful diagram in order to understand the pathway. But at the light of the knowledge mobilization and the PBRN, how do you think that diagram can be implemented?
I think that question, it means that the very first tier, when we start to ask the question of does it work, we're starting with questions that are already got service availability and already have access, and they're already out in community, and they're already going to be readily taken up by clinicians. So you've kind of already half answering the later questions before you even start collecting data on the first one. So then if the treatment that you're examining is found to be effective and cost effective, then the others are a lot easier, because the pain, I mean, osteopathy does not have $1 billion to throw at clinical trial research that no one is going to ever use as a treatment because they don't like it.
Yeah.
They can't afford to do that. And so it means that you're kind of hedging your bets when you do invest in a clinical trial, that you're going to be collecting data that will actually sit well when you come out with the answers.
Excellent. So, Paul said, this is so helpful. It makes a lot of sense, and you are providing the arguments of obtaining grants we need. I think this can make a difference, and I have hopes, again, we can obtain grants using bottom-up approaches of research.
Honestly, co-design and co-creation, they're using the various terms, but funding bodies around the world are wanting to see this stuff.
That's true.
Now, the people assessing the grants might be researchers who haven't quite got their heads around it all, but definitely the ones who are applying for who are writing the funding requirements, they have a lot in there. And they want to see that you're answering real-world questions. The implementation measures on grants now are so, the dissemination in all of those things. They really want to see that they're not just throwing money at an abstract question that's not going to go anywhere. They want to see that the money is being spent on something that's going to matter. And if you can show this process along the way, then you can really make impact.
So thank you very much, Amie, for your time. There are a lot of congratulations for your competency, skills, clarity, and insightful information. That also gave your presentation gave the idea that the network, the connection, and the collaboration across different professionals, but not only. It's important in order to progress from a methodological point of view, from a conceptual point of view, but also from a clinical point of view, in order to make the patient-centered as a real patient-centered in a way. So I would like again to thank all the attendees, and we definitely catch up, as I have a couple of other elements that I would like to discuss with you. But I think it's time for you to enjoy your night. So,
thank you so much for the invitation, Francesco and George, who's unable to be here tonight, and I'm glad everyone felt like they have got something out of it. And please feel free to email me if you need to clarify anything, particularly if my Australian accent was too hard to understand. So
definitely better than my Italian. So no worries.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.